Diablo Immortal, arguably one of the most controversial gaming announcements of all time. Now, of course, being at BlizzCon, I was given the opportunity to actually play the game, and I played this game a lot. So first, I wanted to share with you guys exactly everything we know about the game so far, everything I learned from having conversations with Blizzard employees, everything I learned from actually playing the game for an extended period of time, and of course share my impressions of the game as a longtime Diablo fan, as a longtime Diablo player. And then at the very end, I wanted to share a clip with you guys that I found particularly disturbing. But let's not waste any time, let's get into it. Now, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to encourage you guys to keep an open mind. Let's just assume, if you will, that Diablo Immortal was received with open arms. Let's assume we haven't seen anything about this being a reskin of an existing game. Let's just talk about the game itself. Now, of course, I was at BlizzCon and had the opportunity to sit down, or rather stand up, and play this game quite a bit. I played through each class 5 times, full clears every time, doing as much of the content as I possibly could. I went back and actually tried to farm gear. There were times where I would play for 20, 30 minutes. No one would tap on my shoulder to say, hey, time's up. I did my best to test every skill as best I could, to find bugs as best I could, and really just try to absorb everything there is to know about the game in its current state. So what was the demo in its current state? So the demo was 3 zones. There was like the starter zone, which you're seeing now. There was a kind of open world-ish zone that you go into second, and then finally you end up in a instance dungeon, which you could either do solo or with the group. You also had access to 3 different classes: the barbarian, the monk, and the wizard. All 3 classes had access to 5 of the alleged 12 skills that we're going to have at launch. The maps and mob types were static in the demo. We had no access to the inventory. If you click the inventory button in the top right there, it would just pop up a screen that says disabled in the demo. You could get gear in the demo, as you're about to see here. You just pick it up using that button, and then you equip it by tapping it, and it would give you something arbitrary like plus 12 defense, plus 5 attack. But they of course said that itemization is still something they're looking at and haven't really decided on yet. And some key things to note is that they're still working on the endgame. They're still working on itemization. They're still working on monetization. They're still working out incentivizing group play. So my impressions were that this game is in very early stages of development, and I think that's reflected in the amount of content that we were actually shown in the demo itself. So with just that information at hand, and from what I played at the demo, did I like it or did I not like it? Now, I don't know if it's because I'm so desperate for Diablo content, so thirsty for a new Diablo game, but I did kind of like it. But, I want to make it completely clear how much of the game was actually in the demo. Like this much, like this teeny tiny amount. We actually do not know basically anything about this game. To me, the controls felt fine. A lot of people have said that they are really clunky. I personally used to be a Halo pro, so something in my hands, a controller, usually feels pretty good to me. Yes, it's a touchscreen. It's not the best thing in the world. I'd rather have a controller. But after about 2 or 3 playthroughs, it felt completely fine. It wasn't something that I found to be difficult to pick up. And I don't play mobile games at all. I'm just not a big fan of mobile games. Now, to me, this game felt very much like a Diablo 3.5 with slightly worse graphics. A ton of the same mechanics that we see in D3 have returned in this game. Things like monster affixes. I fought some elites that had arcane laser. Pylons are back. I saw channeling. I saw speed. I saw Berserk, which I don't really know what that did still. There's cursed chests, just like in Diablo 3. Obviously, they said that this game is supposed to take place between Diablo 2 and 3. But to me, it feels just like a Diablo 3 clone for mobile. Nothing about this feels like Diablo 2 to me at all, besides the fact that we were fighting fetishes from Diablo 2. One of the things I picked up on right away, however, was the fact that the maps were static. So some of you guys, that might not mean a lot, but for Diablo has historically been a very dynamic game, meaning like, so when you do rifts inside of Diablo 3, you don't really know where you're going. Yes, you've seen the tiles. They piece together all these tiles, like, you know, you've seen those a million times, but you never really know where you're going. And it kind of leads to experiences feeling a little fresh. It kind of reduces how redundant the game can feel. And it's kind of what makes Diablo Diablo. And I had the opportunity to sit down with Wyatt Chang and kind of ask him about this, because it did seem like the maps were not going to be dynamic. And he basically kind of confirmed exactly my fears, if you will. The maps will be very much static, with the ability to have dynamic quests. The mobs that you see on the screen will be dynamic. Events could change, but the maps themselves will be very, very static. But, you know, killing things felt fun. The skills felt responsive. The boss fight felt good. This guy, Purist the Decimator, you know, he had things like ground effects to avoid. I felt the mob density was quite good, but that's also somewhat alarming because we were hooked up to some high performance cell phones directly to a server. So density was quite good, and it felt like a traditional Diablo experience where you're killing waves and waves of mobs. But could a normal phone handle that? Could a normal phone on a data plan handle something like that? I don't know. We do know that loot is per player, so the loot you see drop is only loot that you see drop. It's not shared across the party. I asked Wyatt Chang about this as well, and he told me that they're still working on ways to incentivize people to play with groups, but they haven't quite figured out what that's going to be. In Diablo 3, that's usually just increased loot chance drop rate, and of course, if someone gets something, they can trade it to you within an hour, and of course, being able to farm higher content than you would be able to do solo, and thus getting more experience in Paragon. Now, I was also told that we were supposed to have access to 8 outdoor zones and 7 instance dungeons at launch. And initially, you might hear that and think that that's pretty good. So like World of Warcraft, for example, BFA had 6 zones and 10 dungeons. So on paper, the numbers sound okay, but you have to keep in mind that these zones are nowhere near as large as a WoW zone. If I had to compare it to Diablo 3, if those of you that are familiar with Diablo 3, I would honestly compare the big outdoor zone to something like Festering Woods. And I'm talking from start to finish. The lanes at times are very, very skinny, like you see here at the bottom. And then sometimes it would lead into like a bigger zone. But it's very linear. Not really that big. Just like Festering Woods isn't really that big. And then if I were asked to describe what a dungeon felt like. So the dungeon that we were in had like 3 open areas and a few staircases. I would honestly kind of describe its size to a dungeon that you might encounter in Festering Woods. Pretty small. Pretty small. You know, whether that's due to this being a mobile game and it has limitations, I don't know anything about that. But of course, you know, as we said earlier, a concern is A, these maps being static, B, they're not really that big, and C, there doesn't seem to be that many of them. But Wyatt Chang did say that the hope is to be able to pump out content fairly fast post-launch. From what he said, you know, very contrary to what they've been doing, you know, with Diablo 3, for example, where we rarely, if ever, see content updates. Now, I've heard other content creators say that they found the game to be quite difficult. I would say completely to the contrary. I found the game to be ridiculously easy. I actually would try to take damage from Purius, whatever you want to call him, the boss in the end of the dungeon. I would stand in his ground effects on purpose, and it would take like 2 or 3 mistakes to really kill you, assuming you didn't hit your health potion. So I found the game to be insanely easy. I get it's a demo and you want a game to feel good. You want players to be dying the whole time. But of course, in a game like Diablo, I would hope that it would be a lot more difficult. And another concern is the fact that, yeah, for some people, these controls are going to feel very, very clunky. So if you make the game too challenging, it's not going to really feel good to those players. But then for players that the game feels fine, it's going to feel really, really easy. So that's a concern that I have there as well. And again, as we kind of touched on earlier, it was on a super sweet phone. The latest, you know, Samsung Galaxy, decent amount of hardware inside that thing, like a $1,200 phone. So I have, you know, an iPhone 7, and it's probably only a couple more months until Apple decides to throttle my CPU. I'm very curious as to the kind of minimum specs that will be required to even play this game. Do keep in mind, again, that what we were shown is such a tiny facet of what this game could actually be. And they can make so many bad decisions from now until release that would just completely kill the game, right? Like any kind of weird monetization schemes would just crush the game. Itemization being bad would crush the game. It being way too simplistic could absolutely crush the game. Now, I do want to touch on a couple of the huge positives that I wanted to take away from Diablo Immortal. And a couple things that would make me particularly sad as a Diablo 3 player, because honestly, a couple of these things inside of Diablo 3 would have been so freaking cool and something that players would have loved. And it sucks to see them in a Diablo mobile title instead of the game that we're kind of stuck playing until we see a new Diablo game, right? So one of those things was the monk has an ability called Kick. By itself, it was actually quite good. I had 3 charges. It's a mobility skill that does damage, so it felt pretty good. But the added effect was that if you kicked off a wall, you could essentially get double the effectiveness out of the skill. So say a mob was between you and the wall, you could essentially kick him, kick off the wall, and then kick back and do double damage, which I found to be particularly cool because, imagine, if you will, you had skills that were quite good on their own, but had some kind of situational effectiveness built on top of them. That's kind of a cool idea. And it's something that I would have really, really liked in Diablo 3. But of course, probably not going to happen. The other thing that I found super interesting, and this was kind of like one of the rare moments at BlizzCon where I felt like the crowd was like, okay, that was pretty fucking cool. Right? One of those super rare moments with people, kind of stop having their side conversations about like, oh, this fucking thing, this thing looks like shit. And they actually, everyone, I felt like, stopped in that moment. I was like, oh. So the wizard has Ray of Frost, which we all know from Diablo 3. It just shoots out a beam of frost in front of her. And then they have this separate ability called Ice Crystal, which puts down a crystal that explodes when you trigger it or after a certain period of time. The thing that was interesting, of course, is if you combine those skills together. So you lay down an ice crystal, you shoot a ray of frost at it, and then boom, it refracts and shoots everything around it, and then the ice crystal eventually explodes. And it's this like kind of combo thing that is pretty cool, and something, again, that we really wish we had in Diablo 3. Because imagine if you're not only picking your skills because, they synergize well with your build, but they actually synergize well with each other. They all kind of do something together. So not only do you have, like, say, your 5 or 6 abilities, but you kind of have the interactivity of those 5 or 6 abilities with each other. So ultimately you have, access to way more skills than just the 5, but still just the 5. And the 5 by themselves are still quite good. And then if you kind of look at the bigger picture that we talked about earlier, so imagine the skill is quite good by itself. The skill has some kind of situational bonus, like the monk having the ability to kick off a wall. And then on top of that, the skill has interactivity with other skills that you might be using. That opens up a lot of possibilities, and it's actually what I thought to be a really cool idea. Now, in practice, we obviously didn't have access to play that combo in beta. We did have access to the kick for monk, and I will say the monk would kick off walls. Like, the walls had to be pretty tall, like full-fledged walls. And I could do it off statues as well, which was interesting. But you couldn't do it off things like trees. Often in the second zone, you saw fences as the boundary. You couldn't kick off a fence. So it was really, really situational how often you could use the kick-off wall, which was kind of disappointing. But I did generally overall like how the skills felt on the demo. They all felt fun to use. I felt the density was good enough to make them all fun to use. So again, if you were to ask me how I would rate the demo, I would give it like a 5 or a 6 out of 10, I guess. It felt okay. But of course, some of the key factors that would make me decide on whether or not I like the game were not in the game in its current state. So it's really hard to say whether or not this game will be good. And there's certainly a ton of decisions they can make from now until release that will absolutely destroy this game or make this game even better. Another side thing I wanted to mention is in Day 2, they kind of revealed some of the Necromancer skills, and Necromancer's kind of my jam. And I noticed the auto attack that the Necromancer has, which you see is him spitting out those green balls. That's his basic attack. And I did mention to Wyatt that I thought that was a pretty atrocious skill. And he did mention that every class would have 2 basic attacks to choose from, so you're not just stuck with one or the other, which is just, information to have. Now, to circle back to kind of some of the negative things, right? A lot of people are saying this is a reskin of NetEase's Endless of God game, which I could definitely see, based on some of the gameplay I've seen, it's very, very, very similar. And again, to me, it felt like the game wasn't hashed out at all. A lot of people are saying in comments like, oh, this game will be out soon because it's just a reskin. But to me, it seemed like this game was like super early stages of development. Nothing seems to be decided on whatsoever. So I'd be super surprised if this game came out anytime soon. And then a lot of people are actually upset that Blizzard has kind of decided to outsource this project to NetEase. Now, my stance on them outsourcing the game is probably not the same as, most of what the masses think. Do I care that they're outsourcing this game? No, not at all. Because that speaks quite a few things. One is hopefully that they're not wasting any of their own dev time on this game. And hopefully that means, they're putting their dev effort into a game like Diablo 4 on PC. God, let's hope. Maybe that means they're not taking any developers away from working on the current Diablo title, Diablo 3. And maybe that means they're not taking any developers away from a Diablo 2 remastered. Whatever you take that as, the point is they're not taking dev time away from Blizzard. So I don't mind. Secondly, let's just assume that Diablo Immortal comes out. There's a few options of what could happen. One is this game totally flops. Two is it flops in NA, but it's super popular in Asia. Or three, it's actually a good game and people like it. Now, in any one of those scenarios, really, Blizzard is at stake, right? So say the game comes out and flops, okay? Well, Blizzard put their name on it, so that makes Blizzard lose credibility. Or say it does really well, Blizzard's going to be like, see, we told you guys all along. And then in the event that it's still successful but people hate it, it still makes them lose credibility from the community, at least. So I don't really care. And on top of that, historically, do we really care? The people at Blizzard aren't the ones working on Diablo? Because if we look at Diablo 3, when Diablo 3 first came out, the masterminds at Blizzard were the people that engineered it. And it was atrocious. It was such a bad game. So when people ask me, do you care that Blizzard outsourced their game? No. Please do. And I say that jokingly, but I'm also kind of serious because I would love, now that we've opened the door for this outsourcing, right? Let's just go ahead and outsource Diablo 3. And some of you guys, might rage at that thought, but at least we might see content if we do that. Because in the grand scheme of things, Diablo 3 isn't really a big title for Blizzard. It's not really netting them that much money. So it's not really a big deal for them to continue working on that game. Whereas if you give Diablo 3 to another company, that's a huge opportunity for that company to work on the game and get their own name out there. So I would bet that a lot of positive things would come from that, which would only benefit us as Diablo 3 players. Now, of course, they could outsource it and they add a bunch of pay-to-win transactions to it, and then it's a shit show. But again, that's Blizzard putting their name on something and then it completely blowing up in their face and losing credibility. So does that bother me? No. It's like a lose-lose for them, and it's a win-win for us because they're only putting their own reputation on the line. And then we as a consumer will just be better informed in the future that Blizzard makes bad decisions. To me, it seems like it's very clear that Blizzard is out of touch with the Diablo community. And to kind of follow up my argument, I want to share with you guys just a super disturbing series of clips from one of the Diablo Immortal Q&A panels from the Blizzard co-founder, Alan Adam. Now, in advance, I'm going to apologize for the quality. It's not my video. It's the only video I could find out there from this QA. But to set this up, he was just asked, basically, is this Diablo Immortal game more for an audience that hasn't really been reached with Diablo games before? And Alan Adam followed up with this.
If you saw the blog post from a couple weeks ago, that was our effort. Those of you who didn't see it, we basically said, I'll paraphrase here, but we said, we think we know what you're hoping to see. We want to remind you that we have multiple Diablo teams working on multiple projects. Good things come to those who wait, but evil things sometimes take longer. And so you can read into that what you want, but that was our effort to let our community know, come with reasonable expectations.
Obviously, as a Diablo 3 player, I hear that and, I'm filled with a little bit of rage because is it not reasonable to expect that after more than a year of no content coming to Diablo 3, is it reasonable to expect that we're going to get some form of content for the game? Absolutely. Absolutely reasonable. So that's just kind of one thing, and it gets worse. So this gets tough. Just breathe.
Our absolute hope and our first, when we draw out what we think our target audience is, the first and foremost are diehard Diablo fans from the PC space. We think that if you love Diablo on desktop, you're going to love being able to play it anywhere in your hand and experience the same characters and the same moment-to-moment gameplay that you already love. You'll just be able to experience it on a new platform.
Blizzard co-founder saying that he thinks if you love Diablo on desktop, you're going to love to be able to play it on other platforms. Couldn't possibly be more out of touch with your own community if you tried. It's one thing to come out and say, you know what, we're just trying to reach a new audience. Totally fine. Get it. Whatever. And he actually says that in this interview. He's like, yes, we do want to reach a broader audience. That makes more sense. And he doesn't even stop there, boys.
But the core of what we're trying to hit here first is our core Diablo audience.
The core of what we're trying to hit here first with Diablo Immortal is our core Diablo audience. PC desktop players. And I truly don't even know what upsets me more. The Diablo Immortal announcement itself, or just the words that come out of this guy's mouth. But I'll leave you guys with that. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. If you had the opportunity to play Diablo Immortal at Blizzard, please also do let me know in the comments below what you thought of it. And as always, guys, like, subscribe, come over to Twitch, ask your questions. I love you guys. Peace out.